It was a warm summer evening in Clearwater, Colorado, the kind where the mountain air feels almost too still. At 9:42 p.m. on June 22, 2024, the automatic glass doors of St. Luke's Medical Center slid open and a woman stepped outside. She moved with the kind of steady pace that didn't draw attention, not rushing, not lingering. The security camera above the entrance captured her profile, a slender figure in a light beige cardigan, tote bag over one shoulder, phone in her hand. Her name was Savannah Holt, 39 years old, mother of two. Known around town for her soft laugh and the way she'd wave at people even if she didn't know them well. That night, though, there was no laugh, no wave. Just a quiet walk to the far end of the parking lot. She had been in the hospital for less than 3 hours, admitted for what the intake notes later described as lightheadedness and anxiety-related symptoms. Her vitals were stable. No injuries. She told the nurse she'd been under a lot of stress at home, but didn't go into detail. She signed herself out at 9:40 p.m., and less than 2 minutes later she was outside in the dark. The hospital's exterior cameras only covered part of the lot, but the footage that survived showed her pausing briefly beside a silver sedan, pulling her phone from her bag and typing. That was at 9:44 p.m. A message went to her younger brother, Ryan. "A friend of his is picking me up. I'll be fine." She didn't clarify who his was. Ryan texted back, "Whose friend?" The reply never came. At 9:47 p.m., another camera, this one mounted on a light pole near the lot's edge, caught Savannah walking toward the exit drive. This camera was grainier, and the distance blurred details, but you could still make out the soft swing of her tote and the faint glow from her phone screen. Then she stepped beyond the range of the lens and into the kind of silence that doesn't leave much behind. In Clearwater, late June nights are quiet. By that hour, traffic on the main road had thinned to the occasional pickup or a delivery truck heading toward the interstate. Investigators later tried to reconstruct her route, starting from the hospital's last GPS ping from her phone. It traveled southeast for a short distance, then shifted toward the winding stretch of Highway 85. The phone's journey was almost too clean, no erratic jumps between towers, no long pauses. It moved as though the person carrying it knew exactly where they were going. At 10:58 p.m., the signal stopped in the vicinity of Summit Gorge, a narrow canyon with a single steel bridge connecting two ridges. The last data point came from 3 separate towers, confirming its location within a quarter mile. That was the end of Savannah Holt's digital trail. No low battery warning. No gradual loss of signal. The SIM card had been removed, killing the connection instantly. To the people who knew Savannah, the idea of her vanishing into the night was unthinkable. She was the kind of person who texted if she was running late, who called her kids from the grocery store to see if they wanted a treat. She didn't go dark. But when she failed to show up at home that night, no one in her household reported her missing. The first call to law enforcement wouldn't come until 5 days later, when Ryan walked into the Clearwater County Sheriff's office and told the desk deputy, "My sister hasn't called, she hasn't texted, she missed FaceTime with the kids." That's not her. He was clear. There was no separation from her husband on record, no history of disappearing before. Something was wrong. The night of June 22nd left more questions than answers, but there were details, small, quiet ones, that stood out once the timeline began to take shape. Savannah had arrived at St. Luke's alone, driving her blue Ford F-150. Her hospital intake form listed no emergency contact. She didn't mention her husband. She told the nurse she felt stressed and lightheaded, and while her blood pressure was high, the staff noted no medical emergency. She was given water, a light snack, and time to rest. By 9:30 p.m., she'd requested to leave. Staff recalled her as polite, calm, and ready to go. But something subtle caught one nurse's attention. When Savannah collected her things, she took extra care to keep her phone in her hand, not in her bag as if she was waiting for a message. After she walked out, there were no confirmed sightings. No one remembered seeing her in the hospital lot beyond the footage. No patients waiting for rides noticed her. And no staff saw her get into a vehicle. The only record of what happened next was hidden in cell tower logs, and even that record ended abruptly at Summit Gorge. The gorge itself is not the kind of place you pass through by accident. The bridge is narrow, 2 lanes with steep drop-offs on either side. On late nights, it's almost empty. There are no businesses, no gas stations, no reason to stop unless you're meeting someone or planning to disappear. 3 days later, a forestry worker named Caleb Myers would tell investigators that, around 1:30 a.m. the night Savannah vanished, he'd been driving home from a fire watch shift when he saw a man walking alone across the bridge. The man was calm, carrying nothing. A red pickup pulled up on the far side and the man climbed in. Myers couldn't see the driver. The taillights disappeared into the darkness. That detail, the red pickup, would later become one of the most frustrating loose threads in the case. Back on the night she disappeared, Savannah's phone stopped transmitting at a spot less than a mile from a small gravel turnout. Investigators wouldn't find her truck there until nearly a week later, but even on that first night, they suspected something about the location. It wasn't a place you'd park if you needed help. There was no lighting, no traffic, and the road shoulder dropped into dense pine. When the F-150 was eventually discovered, it told its own story, one of absence. The tote bag was there. So was a water bottle, a crumpled receipt from Pine Creek Gas and Mart earlier that evening. The phone case was empty. Her keys, wallet, and phone were gone. And there was something else. The driver's seat was pushed back farther than Savannah would have needed. Someone taller had been behind the wheel. Part 1 ends not with a clear crime scene, but with a space where one should be. Savannah Holt walked out of a hospital, carrying her own belongings, and into a night where every trace of her movements was deliberate, right up until they vanished. For investigators, the last sight of her wasn't the grainy hospital footage or the bridge miles away. It was the quiet, measured way she stepped off the curb, tote swinging, phone glowing faintly in her hand. The kind of moment that looks ordinary until you realize it's the last you'll ever see. 5 days passed before anyone outside Savannah's immediate family knew her truck was gone. It wasn't the sheriff's office that found it. It was a state highway maintenance crew clearing roadside debris along Highway 85. On the afternoon of June 27th, one of the workers noticed the nose of a blue Ford F-150 jutting out from behind a stand of lodgepole pines, its rear tires barely on the gravel turnout. The spot was about 40 miles from Clearwater, just west of a steep, winding section of road known locally as Pine Ridge Bend. From a distance, the truck didn't look damaged. There was no broken glass, no dents, nothing to suggest it had been in a crash. But up close things began to feel wrong. The driver's door was closed but unlocked. The keys were missing. The windows were up. There was no dust coating the hood, which meant it hadn't been sitting there for weeks. The afternoon winds on that stretch of Highway 85 were relentless this time of year. Inside the cab, the first thing that caught the deputy's attention was the driver's seat position. Savannah was 5'6". The seat was adjusted far enough back that a man at least 6 feet tall could have driven comfortably. The second thing was what wasn't there. No wallet, no house keys, no phone, and not a single personal item that suggested she'd planned to be gone for long. What was there seemed almost staged in its ordinariness. A cream-colored canvas tote on the passenger seat. A half-empty plastic water bottle in the cup holder. A crumpled receipt from Pine Creek Gas and Mart timestamped 5:52 p.m. on June 22nd, the same evening Savannah was last seen at the hospital. The tote's contents were unremarkable. A folded sweater, a small notepad, 2 pens, and a pack of tissues. Nothing to explain why she would have left it behind. But it wasn't until the forensics team arrived that the unease in that turnout hardened into suspicion. Under a crime scene tech's flashlight, certain surfaces in the cab had a faint smear pattern, not the glossy shine of a thorough cleaning, but the irregular streaks left by someone wiping just enough to blur what was there. The steering wheel, the gear shift, both interior door handles, and the center console latch. They swabbed everything, but most samples came back degraded. The one exception was a partial fingerprint on the inside of the passenger window. It was incomplete, smudged, and useless for identification. What it wasn't was Savannah's. By the time the truck was towed to the county evidence lot that evening, the case had already shifted in the minds of the investigators. This was no longer a missing persons file with the faint hope that she'd simply walked away. This was starting to look like someone had removed her from the equation, and done so carefully. The next morning, Detective Laura Kane, the newly assigned lead on the case, ordered a complete reconstruction of Savannah's final known movements. She wanted a clean timeline, and she wanted to know exactly when the truck had been left there. Witness canvassing along Highway 85 didn't get far. The turnout was secluded, shielded by trees, and not visible from the main road unless you were looking for it. No businesses. No homes. Just 40 miles of mountain road and the occasional trailhead parking lot. A rancher who lived about 2 miles south recalled hearing a vehicle with a loud, uneven exhaust pass by around 11 p.m. on June 22nd. He couldn't say what make it was, only that it slowed near the Pine Ridge Bend before continuing west. The problem was that description matched half the trucks in the county. Digital forensics offered a bit more. Savannah's phone had pinged for the last time at 10:58 p.m., less than a mile from where the truck was found. The signal didn't fade out. It didn't bounce off another tower. It stopped cold. Cellular experts explained that in 2024, even a powered-off smartphone will emit occasional handshake signals unless the SIM card is removed or the phone is destroyed. In Savannah's case, the data log showed a complete cessation of activity, as though the device had been killed on the spot. Then there was her Fitbit. The fitness tracker's final sync with her phone occurred within minutes of the phone's shutdown. At 10:49 p.m., it recorded a rapid spike in heart rate, followed by an abrupt flatline in movement data. The tracker was never recovered. When Laura reviewed the hospital footage from earlier that night, she noticed something she couldn't shake. Savannah's tote bag looked slightly fuller when she left St. Luke's than it did when deputies retrieved it from the truck. It was a small detail and maybe it meant nothing. But in cases like this, Laura knew, nothing often turned out to be the point. If the truck's condition suggested planning, the location screamed intent. Whoever left it there chose a spot that was hard to see from the road, within a short drive of where her phone went dark, lacking any security cameras or passing traffic that might have recorded them. And perhaps most telling of all, it was a place where, unless you were looking, no one would find it for days. By the end of the week, the sheriff's office had released a public bulletin describing Savannah's disappearance and the discovery of her vehicle. They included a brief note about an unidentified red pickup truck last seen in the area that night, a reference to a tip from a forestry worker who claimed he'd seen a man picked up on the Summit Gorge Bridge hours after Savannah vanished. No one came forward to say they recognized the truck. The turnout on Highway 85 was quiet again now, just gravel, dust, and a few scuffed tire marks fading in the summer sun. But in the minds of the investigators, it had become something else entirely, the first fixed point in a case that, so far, had been nothing but empty air. If Savannah's walk out of the hospital had been her first step into silence, the truck was the place where that silence had been parked, locked in, and left for someone else to find. And Detective Laura Kane was beginning to believe that whoever put it there never expected it to be found at all. For Detective Laura Kane, the truck on Highway 85 wasn't just a piece of physical evidence. It was the gateway to something she understood better than tire tracks or partial fingerprints. Data. Every modern disappearance, she believed, had two timelines, the one you could touch and the one you could trace in signals, pings, and digital crumbs. In Savannah Holt's case, the signals were there, until they weren't. The starting point was straightforward. Savannah's phone, a black iPhone 13, had connected to St. Luke's Medical Center's Wi-Fi at 6:58 p.m. on June 22. It stayed connected until she walked out of the hospital at 9:42 p.m. From there, it switched to LTE, pinging a tower on the south side of Clearwater before heading toward Highway 85. The phone's movement was smooth, almost too deliberate. No erratic tower hopping, no long pauses. Between 9:45 and 10:55 p.m., the device stayed on a steady southeast path, hitting 3 towers in sequence. At 10:58 p.m., it connected to a tower near Summit Gorge, the same stretch of road where her truck would later be found. Then, at exactly 10:59 p.m., the signal stopped. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like a dead battery or a phone turned off. But Laura knew better. Even powered down, a smartphone continues to emit brief handshake signals unless it's shielded from service or its SIM card is physically removed. The digital forensics team confirmed it. Savannah's SIM card had been taken out. The action was deliberate, surgical. Whoever did it didn't just want her unreachable, they wanted her untraceable. Her Fitbit told an even stranger story. The device synced automatically with her phone every 15 minutes, logging steps, heart rate, and movement. At 10:49 p.m., it recorded a sharp spike in heart rate, followed by complete inactivity. The sync at 10:55 p.m. captured that last burst of data. After that, nothing. The Fitbit was never found. But the real twist came the next morning. At 9:12 a.m. on June 23, barely 10 hours after Savannah's phone went dark, her iCloud account was accessed from an unfamiliar IP address. The login came from a prepaid Wi-Fi hotspot registered under a false name, traced to a short-term rental address in East Clearwater. By the time investigators got there, the device was gone. The router was found days later in a dumpster behind a strip mall, its storage wiped clean. For Laura, this was the first moment she felt the investigation shift from uncertainty to something closer to certainty. This wasn't random. This wasn't a crime of passion committed in the heat of the moment. This was procedure. Still, there was the matter of the red pickup. The forestry worker's statement was frustratingly vague. A man walking alone across the Summit Gorge Bridge at around 1:30 a.m., calm, carrying nothing. Then a red pickup pulled up and he climbed in. The driver wasn't visible and no plate number was caught. The bridge had no surveillance cameras, and the nearby ranger station's only camera, a motion-triggered wildlife cam, had captured a blurred image of a pickup at 11:48 p.m., about 2 hours earlier. The headlights flared, the body outline suggested an older model truck, but that was all. Laura's team combed through regional traffic cams, gas station security footage, and ATM cameras along every possible route from the gorge. They found nothing. This wasn't entirely surprising. That stretch of Highway 85 was a dead zone for most surveillance. But it was unusual not to catch a single trace of a vehicle that distinctive, which meant either the truck belonged to someone who knew exactly where to avoid cameras, or someone who lived close enough not to pass any on the way home. The deeper Laura went into Savannah's digital life, the more she realized how recently Savannah had begun to guard it. Two-factor authentication was enabled on her accounts. Location sharing was turned off for everyone. Passwords had been changed in April. To Laura, that sounded like someone preparing for a change, someone who suspected they were being watched. Savannah's brother Ryan confirmed as much when Laura visited him. "She told me she thought he was checking her phone," he said, referring to Derek Holt, Savannah's husband. "I told her to be careful. She started writing stuff down instead of saving it on her phone. Said paper was harder to hack." No such notes were found in her truck or in her home office. If they existed, someone else had them now. The pattern was clear. Savannah's phone and Fitbit were silenced within minutes of each other, right near the place her truck would be found. The iCloud login from an untraceable device came the next morning. No transactions, no social media posts, no calls after June 22nd. A disappearance in 2024 without so much as a background data ping is almost impossible, unless someone knows exactly how to make it happen. And in this case, Laura was beginning to think that someone had planned it long before June 22nd. The truck had been the first physical anchor in the case. The digital blackout was the second. Both were precise. Both suggested the same thing. Whoever was responsible wasn't improvising. They were executing. Detective Laura Kane had learned early in her career that disappearances rarely began the day someone was reported missing. The real story usually started months, sometimes years, earlier, in small moments that didn't make it into police reports until after the fact. With Savannah Holt, that earlier story was written in a handful of calls to the sheriff's office, 2 medical visits, and the careful way she had started locking her phone before leaving it in another room. The first official entry in the file came on November 14, 2023. A neighbor had called 911 just after 9 p.m., reporting a loud argument and things breaking at the Holt residence. Deputies arrived to find Savannah standing in the driveway in a gray sweater and jeans, arms crossed tightly, her face pale under the porch light. Derek Holt stood in the doorway behind her, expression blank. The deputies noted light bruising along Savannah's left cheekbone and a small cut near her lower lip. She told them Derek had shoved her into the kitchen counter during an argument about money. She said it wasn't the first time. Derek was arrested on 4 misdemeanor counts of domestic battery. A temporary protective order was issued, barring him from the home. For a while, Savannah stayed with her younger brother, Ryan. But by January she had let him back in. By March, the protective order had expired. Friends told Laura they weren't surprised. Savannah had 2 children still in school, no close relatives in town besides Ryan, and a part-time job that barely covered groceries. She always said she didn't want to blow up the kids' lives, one coworker said. She thought she could keep things calm if she stayed. There was another visit to the sheriff's office in early April 2024, but this one wasn't a report. Savannah had stopped by to ask a deputy about how to start the process of separating finances. The conversation wasn't logged as a complaint, just a public information request, but she had asked about removing someone from a joint bank account. The deputy had given her pamphlets for the county's Family Resource Center and legal aid services. By the time June came around, Savannah's quiet preparations had begun to look like the opening moves in an escape plan. She had opened a new checking account in her own name. She'd started keeping important papers in a locked desk drawer at work. Ryan noticed other changes. She parked her truck facing out whenever she came over. She stopped posting on Facebook. She told him she'd been making handwritten lists instead of saving things on her phone because it's harder to erase a notebook. That last detail stuck with Laura when she and her team conducted the first walkthrough of the Holt home after Savannah disappeared. The house was neat, too neat some would say, but there was no sign of those notebooks. They did find one thing, a spiral-bound pad tucked under the lowest drawer in the small home office. Most of it was grocery lists and budget notes. But near the back was a page that read in Savannah's handwriting. Hospital visit done. Next, secure documents. Talk to Ryan. The date in the corner was June 20th, 2 days before she vanished. If the past months painted a picture of a woman trying to leave, Derek's behavior after she vanished painted another picture entirely. He never called the sheriff's office to report her missing. He never joined the volunteer search groups organized by friends and community members. According to Ryan, when asked about Savannah, he'd say things like, "She needed a break," or "She's done this before." But there was nothing in her history to back that up. Laura arranged a second, more thorough search of the Holt home in mid-July, this time with a warrant. She focused on 3 areas: the master bedroom, the laundry room, and the garage. In the bedroom, luminol testing revealed faint circular patterns near the base of the wall beside the bed, consistent with an area that had been scrubbed clean. In the laundry room, the vent duct behind the dryer had been replaced recently. Inside the vent's lint trap, technicians found short, dark hairs tangled in the blades. Preliminary mitochondrial DNA testing linked them to Savannah's maternal line. In the garage, Blue Star reagent revealed faint spatter on the concrete near the side door. It was too degraded for DNA, but the pattern suggested low-volume arterial impact, a phrase Laura had learned to translate into small but telling. None of it was enough to make an arrest. Each piece on its own could be explained away. Together, they were harder to ignore. Laura kept coming back to something a retired prosecutor had once told her. A house can be cleaned, but it can't be unlived in. The absence of normal is its own evidence. In the Holt home, the normal was gone. Ryan, for his part, was growing more frustrated by the day. "I told her to leave," he said to Laura during one interview. "She was going to. She told me she'd be out by the end of the month. She was just getting everything lined up. And now," he trailed off, shaking his head. He had started carrying a folded missing person flyer in his jacket pocket, handing them out to gas stations and diners along Highway 85. Sometimes people would glance at the photo, then quickly look away. Small towns had long memories. Sometimes those memories kept people talking. Sometimes they kept them quiet. By late July, Laura was convinced of 2 things. Savannah had not left of her own free will. And the events of June 22nd were the end of something that had been building for months. But conviction and proof were 2 different things. To move forward, she would need something more concrete than a cleaned wall and a missing notebook. That something would come unexpectedly from fire. By late July, the case had already stretched thin. Laura Kane had gone over every square foot of Savannah Holt's life, her home, her truck, her digital trail. But each lead seemed to stop just short of where she needed it to go. There was no body, no confession, and no single piece of physical evidence she could take into court without it getting picked apart. Then, on the night of July 28th, the fire call came in. It was a small blaze, the kind that rarely made the news. A patch of dry grass and soil on a 3-acre lot near the edge of Pine Ridge County, about 15 miles from Clearwater. CAL FIRE crews arrived before midnight and had it extinguished within the hour. What made the location interesting was its ownership history. The property had belonged to a distant cousin of Derek Holt until just 2 years earlier. Since then, it had sat vacant. No utilities, no structures, just open land and a thin line of lodgepole pines along the ridge. The fire investigator on scene noted something odd. The burn pattern didn't look like a grass fire that had crept out from a roadside spark. It had started in a shallow depression in the soil, a pit really, and burned hot enough to char the dirt. Tests would later confirm the presence of a petroleum-based accelerant. When Laura heard that detail, she made the drive out herself. The pit was only about 3 feet wide, but the ground inside had a glassy sheen, a sign of sustained high heat. Around the edges were bits of twisted metal and unrecognizable debris. Among them, a melted disc barely larger than a coin caught her attention. The fire techs had already set it aside. Even warped and blackened, it had the telltale backing plate of a smartwatch. Savannah's coworkers had told Laura she wore a silver Fitbit every day. But Ryan remembered something else. 2 months before she vanished, she'd upgraded to an Apple Watch, a gift from a friend who wanted her to track her health more accurately. The watch fragment was sent to the state lab. The serial number had been obliterated by heat, but the design and dimensions matched the exact model Savannah had owned. The lab also found something else in the soil samples from the pit, traces of calcium phosphate. In nature, it can occur in certain minerals, but forensic analysts recognized it from another context. The residue left when bone is exposed to intense, sustained fire. It wasn't proof. Not without identifiable remains. But it was enough to shift the tone of the investigation. Then 2 weeks later it happened again. On August 11th, another fire broke out on a different vacant property, this one owned by an LLC tied to Derek Holt's uncle. Same pattern, small, contained, low intensity, started in a ground-level pit. Same type of accelerant. No obvious reason for anyone to be on the land. No insurance claims were filed for either fire. This wasn't about money. Laura began mapping the timeline. June 22nd, Savannah disappears. June 27th, her truck is found. July 28th, first fire, property linked to Derek's cousin. August 11th, second fire, property linked to Derek's uncle. The spacing wasn't random. Each fire came shortly after a critical stage in the investigation. The first just a week after Laura's team executed the second warrant on the Holt home. The second less than a week after state lab results on the watch fragment came back. It was as if someone was responding in real time. A neighbor near the first property told deputies he'd heard the sound of an idling engine around midnight the night before the fire. No headlights, no voices. Just the steady low rumble of a truck parked somewhere beyond the treeline. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Rural areas are used to odd noises at night. But after hearing about the fire, he mentioned it. The detail stuck with Laura. If the fires were an attempt to destroy evidence, they weren't done in a hurry. Whoever set them had been willing to linger. Satellite imagery from the week before each fire showed faint tire impressions on the dirt access paths leading into both properties. The resolution was too low to identify a make or model, but the spacing suggested a full-size pickup. No surprise there. Derek Holt drove one. So did half the county. Still, Laura logged it. In cases like this, you didn't throw anything away. The official classification of Savannah's disappearance shifted quietly that week. On paper, it was now a homicide, presumed deceased. There was still no body, but the fires, paired with the earlier signs of cleanup, suggested someone was systematically removing whatever traces remained. And if that was true, Laura knew the clock was running out. Evidence doesn't just degrade over time. It can be made to vanish. Ryan took the news hard. So you think she's? He didn't finish the sentence. I think someone doesn't want us to find her, Laura said. He nodded slowly, then looked away toward the ridge. I told her to leave. She was going to. But she waited too long. The fires hadn't given Laura the proof she needed, but they had given her something else. A pattern. Disappearance. Vehicle abandonment. Digital blackout. Signs of cleanup at home. And now, targeted burns on properties tied to the one person in Savannah's life who had the most to lose if she walked away. Patterns could be powerful. In a courtroom, they could be the difference between suspicion and conviction. But only if she could keep building. By the time the second fire was investigated, Laura Kane had learned as much from what people weren't saying as from what they were. In most missing person cases, families flooded the sheriff's office with calls, emails, tips, anything that might keep the search alive. They handed out flyers, gave interviews, pushed on social media. The noise, even if disorganized, was constant. With the Holt family, there was no noise at all. When Savannah vanished, Derek Holt never filed a missing persons report. That came from Ryan 5 days later. In the weeks since, Derek hadn't joined a single search party. He hadn't posted a plea for information on Facebook. He hadn't even returned calls from volunteers organizing search grids along Highway 85. Ryan told Laura he'd asked Derek directly why he wasn't out there looking. Derek's answer was simple. She's done this before. She just needed time. But the truth was, Savannah had never done this before. There was no prior incident, no unexplained trips, no history of walking out on her kids. Laura noticed something else. Savannah's children hadn't been part of any search either. Ryan said it wasn't because they didn't want to help, it was because they weren't allowed to. Derek controlled where they went, who they saw, and when. When Laura tried to arrange informal interviews with the older two through a child welfare liaison, they declined. The youngest were deemed too vulnerable to question. It wasn't open obstruction, but it had the same effect. A wall between investigators and the people who might have noticed something. That wall extended beyond the family home. Former neighbors described Savannah as friendly but increasingly withdrawn in the months before she disappeared. One remembered that she had started backing her truck into the driveway so it was always facing out. Another said they'd heard a loud argument in the Holt backyard a week before she vanished, voices raised, something heavy hitting the fence, but they hadn't called it in. When asked why, the neighbors shrugged. It wasn't the first time. People stopped reacting. The most telling moment came in early September, when Laura interviewed a former friend of Savannah's who had moved 2 towns over. She handed Laura her phone and played a saved voicemail. It was from Savannah, left in late May. "If I disappear," she said quietly, "please look for me." No names. No details. Just that. The friend admitted she hadn't thought much of it until the news broke. "I figured it was just stress talking," she said. "Now, I don't know." In the community, theories circulated quietly. Some thought Savannah had run off to start a new life. Others assumed she was dead, but they spoke about it with a detachment that unsettled Laura, as if the conclusion had been reached before the evidence. The longer Savannah was gone, the quieter the talk became. Not because people forgot, but because they decided nothing they said would change the outcome. Laura recognized the pattern. In households marked by long-term control and abuse, isolation worked both during and after the victim's presence. It discouraged interference. It made people second-guess what they'd seen. It closed the narrative before the body was ever found. One of the most frustrating interviews Laura conducted that fall was with a woman who had been listed as a witness in the 2023 domestic disturbance report. She lived just a few houses away from the Holts. When asked if she remembered that night, the woman said, "I don't want to get involved anymore." She wouldn't elaborate. By late September, Laura's whiteboard was filled with columns. Known actions: disappearance on June 22nd. Truck found June 27th. Digital blackout. 2 fires. Physical evidence: partial DNA in laundry vent. Watch fragment. Burn residue. Patterns of cleaning. Behavioral indicators: no search effort from spouse. Restricted access to children. Delayed or avoided cooperation. Community notes: gradual withdrawal. Witness reluctance. Voicemail warning. The pattern was stark. Savannah hadn't just been removed. The space she'd occupied was being actively closed off. Ryan refused to let it rest. He worked with local advocacy groups to organize vigils. He put Savannah's face on posters in every grocery store and gas station in Clearwater County. He gave interviews, sometimes with his voice cracking but always with the same message: "She didn't leave us. Someone took her." Laura admired his persistence. But she also knew how hard it was to break through silence that deep. In early October, Laura sat in her office long after the rest of the team had gone home, staring at the growing list of unanswered questions. The fires had removed whatever physical traces might have been left. The digital trail had been killed with precision. And the people who might have been able to speak most clearly either wouldn't or couldn't. Cases like this didn't go cold in a single moment. They froze gradually, layer by layer, until even the air around them felt solid. Laura was determined not to let that happen. By mid-October 2024, the Savannah Holt investigation had reached a place Laura Kane knew all too well: the invisible line between suspicion and prosecution. They had a pattern. They had motive indicators. They had physical and digital evidence pointing toward a deliberate disappearance. But they didn't have what juries often cling to: a body. And without a body, everything had to work harder. In California, Laura had worked cases where prosecutors moved forward without remains. It was possible but risky. The standard wasn't just proving someone had the opportunity or reason to kill. You had to establish corpus delicti, proof that a crime had occurred, without the single piece of evidence most people think of first. Now, in Colorado, she faced the same challenge. She started with the timeline wall in her office. At the top, a single line: June 22, 2024, 9:42 p.m., Savannah leaves St. Luke's Medical Center. From there, the red thread stretched down through the hours and weeks. 10:58 p.m., final phone ping at Summit Gorge. Truck abandonment, found June 27th, partially wiped down, keys and phone missing. Digital blackout, SIM removed, Fitbit offline within minutes, iCloud login from untraceable hotspot next morning. Signs of cleanup: luminol patterns in bedroom, hair in laundry vent, degraded spatter in garage. The fires, July 28th and August 11th, both on family-linked properties, accelerant use, watch fragment with calcium phosphate trace. Behavioral silence: no search effort by spouse, restricted access to children, witness reluctance. It wasn't a straight line, it was a web. But webs could catch things. Laura called in the county's forensic accountant. Together, they revisited Savannah's and Derek's financials. The small transfer Savannah had made into her own account before she vanished showed intent to separate. Derek's purchases: cleaning supplies, heavy-duty trash bags, a rural waste disposal bin rental, showed post-event organization. Then came the property transfers. Both burn sites had changed ownership within days of the fires, one to a cousin, the other to an LLC with no online footprint. The speed was unusual, especially with no apparent sale value. With the case now formally classified as homicide, presumed deceased, Laura had the backing to bring in the state's behavioral analysis unit. The analysts agreed, the disappearance wasn't impulsive. It had elements of staging, controlled timing, and counterforensic measures. Whoever was responsible likely had prior familiarity with law enforcement tactics, or had studied enough cases to mimic them. Still, there was a gap between likely and provable. To bridge it, Laura returned to the site where the truck was found. This time, she brought a cadaver dog unit and ground-penetrating radar. The dogs didn't alert to human remains, but the radar picked up 2 irregular soil disturbances along a private trail less than 300 yards away. The soil, when tested, showed trace combustion residue, similar to the burn pits, but no identifiable remains. It was the kind of finding that was maddening, enough to keep the suspicion alive, not enough to nail it down. By November, Laura sat down with the district attorney's office for a pre-charging conference. The DA was blunt. "We can build this, but without a body you need every single point to lock tight. Any one thing that's shaky, a defense attorney will tear the whole thing apart." That meant every step in the timeline had to connect. The hospital departure, the truck, the phone shutdown, the cleanup, the fires, the silence. Not just individually suspicious, but collectively undeniable. Laura left that meeting with a renewed sense of urgency. The longer the case stayed open without charges, the more likely evidence, physical, digital, and human memory, would fade. She doubled back to interview the one person she thought might crack the silence, the witness who had the voicemail from Savannah. This time, Laura didn't ask about the call itself. She asked about the weeks before it. The friend remembered something she hadn't mentioned. Savannah had been worried about someone following her, and had started changing her driving routes home. It was a small detail, but it matched other elements. The parking facing out, the location sharing turned off. It reinforced that Savannah anticipated something happening. Ryan, meanwhile, wasn't letting go. He organized a vigil at the Summit Gorge turnout in early December, candles lined along the guardrail where her phone had gone dark. Laura attended quietly, standing in the shadows, listening as Ryan told the group. She didn't walk away. And we're not walking away either. As 2024 closed, Laura's team had more than they'd started with, but still not enough to move without risk. She kept the case active, kept the pressure steady, knowing that in no-body homicides, persistence was often the only weapon left. Because somewhere between the hospital door at 9:42 p.m. and the silence that followed, Savannah Holt's life had been taken. And someone had worked very hard to make sure no one could prove it. Laura intended to prove it anyway.